In this video we will implement together Nestjs Authentication, which actually means we will implement registration, logging, obtaining JWT token and authorizing our requests. And here I already generated for us an empty Nestjs project. What I have here is source and the user folder, and everything here is completely empty. We have a user module with nothing but controller and service, and here is our controller, which is completely empty, and this is a service, it is also empty. And the first thing that we want to implement is our registration method. This is why we can jump inside our user controller, and here we can create our new post request, which will be /users. And here we can create a function with any name. I prefer create user, and we know that inside we must read a body from our post request. For this we can use a decorator body that we are getting from Nestjs out of the box, and what we are getting inside body is some data that we want to validate. And in order to do that, typically in Nestjs applications we are using DTO, which actually means here we can write something like create user DTO, and this is create user DTO. So what is this DTO? This is an additional class which validates our data. And in order to make it working, we must install additional package. This is why I am jumping to the console and I am installing here class validator package. After installation, we want to create this create user DTO. This is why here inside source user, I can generate a new folder DTO, and inside here will be a file create user.dto.ts. So what is DTO? This is just a plain class. This is why here let's export our new class create user DTO, and here we must specify all fields which we will read from our body. In our case, it will be a read-only field, username, and our username is a string. We also need a read-only field for our email, because this is a registration form, and the last one here is password. When we are using DTO, we are sure that we will read through our body only these fields and none other fields. As we installed class validator, we can apply several decorators here. First of all, we can say is not empty decorator, and we are getting it directly from class validator, which actually means now our username can't be empty. Exactly the same we can do for our email, so is not empty, and additionally one more decorator is email. And for the password we also need is not empty. So this is exactly a schema for our body, and now we can jump back inside our controller, and here we can import our create user DTO. Now we must specify what we are getting back. As we didn't create any types, I will simply write any, but obviously we will remove it later. Now here what I want to do, I want just to return a string create user, so we can test it in browser, and here I want to console log our create user DTO that we just created. As you can see here, I am getting an error that we must return inside our async the promise any and not just any. This is why I will return here a promise any, just like TypeScript wants. Now I can open Postman and try to do a post request on our localhost 3000/users. But we are mostly interested in our body, and as you can see here, my body is email foo@gmail.com, username foo and password 123. I'm hitting here send, and as you can see back, we got our string create user. This is exactly what we returned here. But most importantly here inside console, we are getting our create user DTO, email, username and password. Now what we want to do, we want to call here our service, and inside service we want to create a user. This is why here instead of console log, we want to get back a user by calling await this user service that is already injected, and here we want a method like create user, where we are providing inside create user DTO. You might ask why we didn't write this code inside controller, because we want to isolate all our code which is related to database inside services, and our controllers are simply building some responses for the API. So let's create this create user method. Now inside our user service, we want to create an asynchronous method create user, and we know that here we are getting our create user DTO of type create user DTO. Again, I will return here promise any, because we didn't create any entities yet. But now here we want to pack all our code which is related to database, but we didn't configure a database inside our application. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have a membership here on the channel that you can join to support me. It will give you access to the new videos earlier, emojis and priority replies to your comments. Now let's jump back into the video. I already have a MongoDB which is running on my machine, which means I must install correct packages here to configure it inside Nestjs application. This is why here I will write npm install mongoose and nestjs/mongoose. So if you don't know, mongoose is a wrapper for MongoDB to work with the database, and Nestjs mongoose makes bindings for MongoDB inside Nestjs. After this, we must configure MongoDB globally correctly. This is why we must jump inside our app module, and inside our imports we want to register mongoose module that we are getting from Nestjs mongoose. And here we want to call for root, and we must provide inside a URL of MongoDB where we want to connect. And in our case it is MongoDB localhost, for example app. With this single liner our mongoose is connected to our application. But we're still missing for our user feature the user entity. Why do we need user entity? Because we need to create something which allows us to make all these requests to the database, like save record, find records, and so on. This is why here I want to create a new file, user.entity.ts. And here we need to export our class, which will be user entity. And on the top of it we must provide a decorator which is called schema, and it is coming from Nestjs mongoose. Now inside we want to specify all fields of our user when we will save it inside database. And in order to do that we are using prop decorator, and after this we are providing that we want to save an email and it is a string. Now we can copy paste this code and create not only email but also a username, just like we got from our registration, and here is our password. But additionally for passwords we never want to get them back when we are making some requests. Why that? Because this is not safe. You simply want to get a user, you are responding with this user to the frontend, and you are exposing your hashed password to the frontend. We never want that. This is why here we must provide select false. In this case we will never select in any queries implicitly password. Now here we must generate a schema based on our user entity. This is why here let's export our user entity schema. And for this we are using schema factory, which we are also getting from Nestjs mongoose, .create for class, and inside we are providing our user entity. What we must do now, we must allow to work with this entity inside our user module. This is why I'm jumping inside user module, and here in the imports I can write mongoose module dot not for root but for feature, and inside I want to provide an array with objects. And in our case here we are providing inside object the name. It will be our user entity dot name that we just created, and our schema will be user entity schema that we also generated. With this line we are allowing our module to use user entity and make all these requests to the database. Now let's try to do some requests. I want to jump back inside our service, and now here we can use our model. But in order to use that we must inject it inside constructor. So we're using for this a decorator inject model, and we're providing inside our user entity that we just created .name. And here we must create a private property user model, which will be a reference, and this is actually a model of mongoose with the type user entity that we just created. This is how we typically inject our models inside services when we want to use them. Now, first of all, what we need to do inside our register, we want to check if the email that we wrote is not taken. This is why here I want to try and find the user by calling await, and here we can access our user model, and we have lots of different methods. I want to use here find where and provide a predicate. And in our case, we want to find the user by email, and we know that we have an email inside create user.dto.email. which actually means this line will return for us either a user or null if we don't find it. This is why here I want to say that if we found a user, we want to throw exception, because we can't create a new user and the email is already taken. For this we can use throw new HTTP exception, and we're getting it from Nestjs, and here we're providing our error message, email is already taken. And as a second parameter, we're providing an HTTP code. It is HTTP status dot unprocessable entity. It will be a 422 error, as you can see here, which actually means with this code we are already on the safe side that we don't create a user with the same email. After this, I want to generate a new user and save him. This is why here let's create a property created user, and for this we're calling new this user model, and we're providing inside create user DTO, which actually means our created user is a document but we didn't save it yet. This is why I want to write here return created user.save. This will directly save the user to the database and it will respond with our record. Let's check if it's working. We don't have any errors inside console. And now I want to send this request/users to our API. As you can see here, we still get create user because we didn't build the correct response. This is why first of all here we want to change our promise any to promise user entity, because we know after we generate a user we will return this entity. Now we must jump inside our controller, and after we got a user we want to return it here. Let's check again. I am hitting send, and as you can see I am getting an error email is already taken. And actually this is totally correct because I am clicking this send button the second time, which actually means when we clicked it previously, it was also created. Let's change our email to bar and our username also to bar. I'm hitting send now, and this is our response from the database. This is all fields which were created in our database, and for us most importantly is email, username, password, and this is the ID that was generated. I want to point out that our password was not hashed and we simply stored it as it is. This is not safe and we should never do that. This is why we must fix it as soon as possible. In order to hash a password, we typically use a bcrypt library. This is why here I am jumping to console and I am installing it here. Now we can go back inside our user entity, and what we want to do before saving of our entity, we want to hash our password. This is why here after our user entity and after our schema, we can write user entity schema.pre, and we are providing inside pre user entity, and we are passing inside save, which actually means we want to execute something pre or before save. And here is our callback. Our callback is an asynchronous function where we are getting next, and this is a function, which actually means we must do something inside this function and then call next. And what we want to do, we want to hash our password, and we want to assign the result back inside password that we are trying to save. This is why here I want to write await hash, and as you can see this hash is exactly from bcrypt. And inside we can provide this password, 10, and it will hash a password, and now we are not storing our password as a plain text. After this we need to call next, and it will say that we can proceed with saving our record. Let's try again. I'm changing here an email to buzz and I'm saving it with password 123. I'm hitting here send, and as you can see our password was correctly hashed, and now we're storing it as a hash string and not as a plain password. This is extremely important. And here I want to point out one problem that we have. If we jump to our user service, you can see that we're returning here a user entity, and user entity contains all fields of our user. Now I'm jumping inside user controller and I'm writing here user dot, and as you can see we're getting autocomplete with email, password and username. And essentially this is not valid because we don't return password, because we are cutting it from our response, which actually means we are lying TypeScript that we are getting password. What would be better if we will transform the whole user, doesn't matter if we got password back or not, in the format which is suitable for the response. And in order to do that, I want to create here a new folder types, and inside let's create a user response type.ts. And now what we can write here is that we have a type user response type, and we can call here omit on our user entity, and we want to omit here our password. In this case, we are fully safe because our user response type won't have a password inside. But now the question is how we will get this type, and in order to do that, I recommend to create an additional function inside our user service, and we can name it, for example, build user response. And what it does, it transforms our user entity to the response. This is why here we're getting user entity, and we know that this is a user entity, and what we're responding with is user response type. And the only thing that I want to do here is simply return only fields that we need inside our response. In our case, it is a username, so userEntity.username, and also an email. It is userEntity.email, but no password. But again, we won't return inside our create user in the service our user response type. We're returning here all entities from the database. But what we can do now inside our controller, we can return not just user, but this .userService.buildUserResponse, and we're providing a user entity or simply a user inside. In this case, we're always on the safe side. Doesn't really matter if user contains password or not. We're stripping all fields that we don't need or generating additional fields for our response. Let's check if it's working. I'm hitting here send, and as you can see, we just get back our username and email. We don't have additional fields that were there because they were all stripped out by our function. And additionally to that, we can remove this promise any now, and we can write here that we're returning user response type, and now we don't have any inside our application. Our next step here is to implement logining because we already implemented registration. And actually we can copy-paste all code because it will be similar. First of all, we will have a post request on /users/login, and here we can name this method login, and we're getting here a body, but in our case now we don't have a create user DTO, but a login DTO. This is why here let's change it to login DTO, and we must create it now because we don't have it yet. Now here we will respond with user response type, this is totally fine, but instead of create user we must implement a login user method, where inside we will pass login DTO. And after this we will call build user response just like inside registration. Now let's create our login DTO. This is why inside DTO we can simply copy our create user and rename it to our login.dto.ts because it is almost the same. Our class will be not create user, but login DTO, and we have just two fields, our email and password, so no username. Other than that, we don't change it. Now we can jump back inside our controller and import here login DTO. Now the only thing that we're missing is this login user function. So let's jump back inside our service and create here this function. So we have an asynchronous function login user, and we know that here we're getting login DTO of type login DTO. What we're getting back from it is a promise with user entity, just like after registration. And the first thing that we need to do is try and get a user by such email from the database. This is why here let's get a user, and here we can use this user model.find1, and we're finding our record by email. This is why here email must equal login DTO.email. But this line is not enough because it won't get us a password. Just to remind you, our password is excluded in all find requests by default. In our case with login, we must have inside the password. Why is that? Because we need to compare the login password of the user with the password in the database. In order to do that, we must select it. This is why we're writing here .select, and we want to write plus password, and it will additionally select the password inside our user. Now here we must write a check if this email is not found. So if we didn't find the user, then we want to throw an exception. I will copy an exception inside, and we can simply change the text to user not found, and it is also an unprocessable entity. After this, we must compare our password. So here we need a property like is password correct, and we want to call here an await compare. And as you can see, compare we're also getting from bcrypt and we can compare our plain password and the hashed version. This is why here we must provide login.dto.password, and we want to compare it with user.password from the database. But as you can see here, we are getting an error. Property password does not exist on type query document, and the error might not be clear for you. And actually the problem is that here we are getting a user, but I forgot to write await. This is way back, we didn't get a user document. Now it is totally fine, and we are comparing our hashed password with our plain password. And if password is not correct, we want to throw an exception. This is why here, if not is password correct, we want to write incorrect password response, and it is also unprocessable entity. If everything is fine, we can simply return the whole user back, which actually means we are successfully logged in. Let's test this out. I don't have any errors. And now let's make a request on /user/login, and we're interested only in email and password, for example, buzz and password 123. I'm hitting here send, and as you can see, we successfully got our user and email back. But if I'm writing here password 1234, then we got incorrect password back. This is totally fine. And if we have a case that email does not exist, then we are throwing an error user not found, which actually means we successfully implemented logining and covered all cases that we need. Now we must talk about JWT token. Why is that? Because every single time when we are logging in or registering a user, we want to return a JWT token for the client so it can authenticate itself later. This is how it works. We provide from the backend a unique string, client stores it, and uses later to authenticate their request, which actually means they provided inside headers this storage string, and we parse it back, and we're getting what user this is, and we authorize the request. And the first step here is to generate this JWT token. This is why here I want to jump inside console and install the additional package JSON Web Token. And what it does, it helps us to generate and decode tokens. And the question is where we want to generate a token. It is not related to database at all. We must generate it inside our build user response, because this is exactly the layer where we're generating something as an API response. So here we will write token, and here we must provide some unique token. How we can generate that? In order to do that, I want to create a function generate JWT, and we're providing inside our user entity, which is a user entity. And back we will generate a string. And in order to generate it, we will call a method which is called sign, and it is imported directly from JSON Web Token. Now inside we're providing an object with any fields that we want. In our case, we will provide just an email because this is our unique identifier. And here we can write user identity.email, and as a second parameter, we must provide some JWT secret to parse this token back. This secret must be unique, and typically nobody knows except of the backend this string, and you for sure should not store it on the client. This is why here I will write JWT secret, but it can be any string. So this single liner will generate for us a token, and now here inside our token we can call this .generateJWT, and we're providing inside our user entity. But here we're getting an error, token is not a valid property inside our user response type. This is why let's jump inside user response type and add here an object with token, which is a string. Let's jump back here. Now we don't have any errors because this is the correct typing for it. Now let's try and authenticate our user. I'm hitting send here, and additionally to our username and password, we're getting the token, which is a JWT token, which we can use later on the client. Most importantly, we got this token both in register and login of the user. And the last thing that we need to implement is parsing of this token and getting a current user, because typically developer on the client will implement this login, will get this response back, and will store this token, for example, inside local storage. Then later he must do a request to get a current user with this token. This is exactly what we want to implement. We must jump back inside our user controller, and we want to implement here a GET request. And this is a request on /user, and this is an asynchronous function which returns for us current user. So what we want to get back, again, a promise with our user response type. But now is the tricky part. What we want to do here, we want to parse a token from the header, and based on it, we want to fetch a user and return this user back. The main problem is that we can create lots of authenticated requests, like for example, creating of the article for specific user. And we don't really want to write this logic of parsing header and finding a user by token in every single controller. It doesn't make any sense. This is why the idea is that we generate a middleware. What is middleware? This is some code before we hit controller. In this case, we can parse there our token and find the user and attach it to our request. Then we can directly in any controller, in any action, get this user and understand that we are logged in, and we can return this data. This is why instead of this code, we must create a new folder which is called middlewares. And here we want to create a new file, auth.middleware.ts. So what is middleware inside Nestjs? This is just a class, and here we are writing injectable, and we're exporting here our auth middleware, and we can write implements nest middleware. We're directly getting here an error because we must implement property use inside. In order to do that, we must create a function use, and inside we are getting request, response, and next. And all these functions are coming from Express. So here we can get next function from Express, but also request and response. And here we can type that our request is of type request, and our response is of type response, and our next function is exactly next function. And as you can see here, I wrote in request response. This is not correct. It should be request. After this, what we want to do first is to check if inside our request, inside headers, we have this token at all. So we can write here, if we don't have inside request, headers, our token authorization, and actually you can name it like you want, but typically the name is authorization, then we want, first of all, inside our request to set a user to null, because we want to say, okay, this user is not authorized, and after this we can simply call next and return. Why that? Next means that we must proceed to the controller and we don't need to use this middleware anymore. But as you can see here, we have a problem inside our request. We don't have such field as user, and we must somehow implement it. What I want to do, I want to extend this interface and build our own interface. So we can create here an interface which is called, for example, express request, and I want to extend it from normal request. But additionally, I want to pass inside a user which can be undefined, and I want to save here our user entity. Now here, instead of this request, we can write express request, and then we're not getting an error. Because now in all places we will use our express request, and inside we're waiting to have a user. So this was the first case. It means that we are not logged in. Now we can try and parse our token. So here we will get our token by calling headers authorization, and we want to use split space. And here we want to take only the second element. Why are we doing it at all? Because when we're implementing authorization, we typically provide a value as a string token space and then our token. This is how it is done by specification, which actually means we don't really need this word token and space, we just need our second element after the split. This is exactly what it does. It gets back just a string of our token that we need. And what we want to do here, we want to try and decode this token because it can be invalid. This is why here try and catch, and here we will get an error. And if we for some reason got an error, we couldn't parse it, then we can simply copy and paste here our request user equals null and next, because it means that token is invalid and we're not logged in. Now inside try we need to decode our token, and here I want to save it in the property decode, and I'm calling here verify method, and inside I'm providing a token and our secret string, and it was a JWT secret. But as you can see here inside the code, as a type we're getting string or JWT payload, because essentially JSON Web Token doesn't really know what we saved inside. This is why here I want to say that this is an object with email as a string. We're sure because we saved it inside like this. Now after this, what we want to do is to find our user in the database. And in order to do that, we must inject our model here. So we must create a constructor, and we want to read our property user service by calling user service. Now what we want to do here, we must inject our service so we can use it in order to work with the database. And I'm injecting here our user service of type user service. And now what we want to do, we want to find a user by email, but we don't have such functionality yet. This is why here inside our service, let's create a new method which is find by email. And here we're providing an email, which is a string, and back we want to get a promise with our user entity. This is why here I want to return this user model dot find one, and I simply provide inside email to find the user. In this case, we don't need to inject there a model, we can simply use our service. So I'm jumping back to our middleware. And now here I want to get a user by this decoded information. So we're waiting for this user service dot, and here we have our find by email, and we're providing inside decode.email. In this case, we will get a user back. And as you can see here, we're getting an error that await is not possible to use inside plain functions. This is why here I want to write an async word, and it is fine now. After we got our user, we must write it inside our request.user, and we can call next because we are done with our code. So what we did here inside our middleware? First of all, if we don't have authorization token, we are not logged in. Then we are trying to parse a token and verify it. And if it is fine, then we are getting the user from the database, and we are storing it directly inside request, and we should not forget to call our next function. Now what we want to do, we want to apply this middleware to the whole application. This is why here I want to jump to our app module, and inside our class I want to write configure and provide inside consumer, which is a middleware consumer, and now inside we can write consumer apply to provide a middleware. And we're writing here auth middleware that we just created dot for routes. And we're providing here path star, which means we're applying it to all our routes. And the method that we want to apply it is request method dot all, which actually means we want to cover all our API with this middleware. And every single time when we are passing a header, it will test it. And with all that code done, we can implement our get method in seconds, because inside our user controller, here when we are getting the user, we are sure that inside the request, we are getting a user which is either null or user entity. This is why here in our request, we can use a decorator request in order to read the request that we need. And as you can see here, I will use express request and not just request from express, because this specific interface has a user inside. Now we can check here, do we get inside our request a user? And if we did not, then we want to throw an error. So here is throw new HTTP exception, and we can provide here unauthorized, and the status here will be HTTP status dot unauthorized, which means 401. After this, we can use this user to respond. This is why here we can simply call this user service dot build user response, and we're providing inside request.user, which actually means we don't even need to call here a service, because our middleware prepares current user for us, and this request will read a user and respond with current user if we're authorized. Let's check this out. We don't have any errors. And here what I want to do, I want to save this token that we got after login, and now I want to make a GET request on /user. And first of all, I don't want to provide anything, I simply hit send, and as you can see, we got 401 unauthorized, because we did not provide for this API call a correct header. Now here inside authorization header, I want to write token and then paste this token that I just copied. I'm hitting here send, and as you can see, we successfully got back all information about this authorized user. Now our backend can always check if the user with this token is allowed to get back needed information or not. And actually, if you're interested to learn Nestjs on the real project, make sure to check my course here on YouTube.